spring morning mist hung low over the Auxiliary Territorial Service Training Center at Camberley, Surrey. The year was 1945, and across the compound, the familiar sounds of military life echoed through the dawn air. Engines coughed to life, tools clinked against metal, and voices called out instructions in the crisp April morning. But among the routine bustle of wartime Britain, something extraordinary was unfolding. Something that would challenge everything the observers thought they knew about royalty, duty, and the nature of service itself. Klaus Müller, a German prisoner of war assigned to vehicle maintenance duties, stopped mid-stride as he approached the motor pool. There, beneath the raised hood of a military truck, he saw a young woman in ATS uniform, her sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the engine compartment. Grease stained her fingers as she adjusted a carburetor with practiced precision. Someone whispered beside him in broken English, "That's the princess." Klaus blinked hard, certain he had misheard, but as he watched, the impossible scene continued to unfold before his eyes. Princess Elizabeth, heir to the British throne, was performing the same mechanical work that he and his fellow prisoners had been assigned. This was not the Britain that Nazi propaganda had described. This was not the decadent aristocracy they had been taught to despise. This was something entirely different, and it would reshape everything these men believed about their captors. The path that led Princess Elizabeth to this moment had begun years earlier, as the war consumed Europe and transformed British society. Born in 1926, she had spent her formative years witnessing the resilience of the British people as they faced the relentless bombing of the Blitz. While other royal families fled to safety, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth made the deliberate choice to remain in London, sharing the dangers faced by their subjects. Night after night, as air raid sirens wailed across the capital, the young princess watched from the windows of Buckingham Palace as fires lit the London sky. She saw the courage of ordinary citizens who emerged from underground shelters each morning to rebuild what the bombs had destroyed. She witnessed the quiet heroism of firefighters, nurses, and volunteers who kept the city functioning despite the constant threat of death from above. As she grew older, Elizabeth felt an increasing desire to contribute more directly to the war effort. She watched her contemporaries join the Women's Land Army, work in munitions factories, and serve in various auxiliary roles. The weight of her privileged position began to feel like a burden rather than a blessing. While others her age risked their lives for their country, she remained protected behind palace walls. In early 1945, as the war entered its final phase, Princess Elizabeth made a decision that would scandalize some and inspire others. She approached her parents with a request that challenged centuries of royal tradition. She wanted to enlist in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. The discussions within the royal household were intense. Advisors worried about security risks, protocol breaches, and the precedent such service might set. But the princess was determined. "I ought to do as other girls of my age do," she argued. "If I am to be queen one day, I must understand the lives of those I will serve." King George VI, himself a veteran of the Great War, understood his daughter's motivation. After careful consideration and extensive security arrangements, he gave his consent. In February 1945, Princess Elizabeth became the first female member of the royal family to serve full-time in the armed forces. The media reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Newspapers dubbed her Princess Auto Mechanic, and photographers captured images of the heir to the throne learning to change tires and repair engines. But for Elizabeth, this was not a publicity stunt. It was a genuine commitment to serve her country in its hour of greatest need. Her destination was the ATS No. 1 Mechanical Transport Training Center at Camberley, a sprawling complex of workshops, classrooms, and barracks where young women learned the technical skills necessary to keep Britain's military vehicles operational. The center trained drivers, mechanics, and maintenance specialists who would support the final push toward victory in Europe. When Princess Elizabeth arrived at Camberley, she insisted on receiving no special treatment. She was assigned to the same barracks as other trainees, slept on the same narrow beds, and followed the same rigorous schedule that began each day at 6 in the morning with reveille. The training was comprehensive and demanding. Students learned to diagnose engine problems, replace worn parts, and perform complex repairs under time pressure. They studied the mechanics of trucks, ambulances, and armored vehicles. They learned to read technical manuals, interpret wiring diagrams, and troubleshoot electrical systems. Princess Elizabeth threw herself into the work with characteristic determination. Her instructors noted her quick grasp of mechanical principles and her willingness to tackle the dirtiest, most challenging tasks. She learned to change spark plugs, repair punctured tires, and rebuild transmissions. Her hands, once soft and carefully manicured, became calloused and permanently stained with engine oil. Fellow trainees, initially awed by her presence, soon came to respect her for her work ethic and lack of pretension. "She gets her hands as dirty as anyone else," one instructor observed. "She never asks for special consideration, and she never complains about the work." The princess's dedication was particularly evident during practical exercises. When a convoy of vehicles broke down during a training mission, she worked alongside her classmates through the night to get them operational again. When a critical ambulance needed emergency repairs, she volunteered for the most difficult and dangerous task of crawling underneath the vehicle to access the damaged components. But Princess Elizabeth was not the only person at Camberley whose presence challenged conventional expectations. The facility also housed a significant number of Axis prisoners of war who had been assigned to support roles in vehicle maintenance and logistics. By 1945, Britain held more than 400,000 German and Italian prisoners, captured during the various campaigns across Europe and North Africa. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment of these men, but Britain went further than mere compliance with international law. The government recognized that these prisoners represented a valuable labor resource at a time when British manpower was stretched to its limits. Many POWs were assigned to agricultural work, helping to maintain food production while British farmers served overseas. Others worked in construction, rebuilding infrastructure damaged by bombing raids. A significant number were assigned to military installations, where they performed maintenance and support functions under careful supervision. The prisoners at Camberley came from diverse backgrounds. Some were career soldiers who had fought in multiple campaigns. Others were young conscripts who had been swept up in the final desperate battles of the war. Among them were mechanics, engineers, and technicians, whose skills made them valuable assets in maintaining the complex machinery of modern warfare. For these men, captivity in Britain was a revelation. They had been conditioned by years of propaganda to expect brutal treatment at the hands of their enemies. Instead, they found themselves housed in clean barracks, fed regular meals, and treated with basic human dignity. The contrast with their expectations was so stark that many initially suspected it was an elaborate deception. Klaus Meller, the German soldier who first witnessed Princess Elizabeth at work, had been captured during the Normandy campaign. A former automotive mechanic from Bavaria, he had been assigned to maintain German military vehicles before his capture. His technical skills made him a natural choice for assignment to the Camberley motor pool. Klaus's first weeks in British captivity had been a series of shocks to his worldview. He had expected harsh interrogation, inadequate food, and brutal working conditions. Instead, he found himself working alongside British mechanics who treated him with professional respect. The work was demanding but fair, and the guards maintained discipline without cruelty. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of British royalty performing manual labor. In Nazi Germany, the concept of aristocratic service was limited to military leadership roles. The idea that a princess would voluntarily dirty her hands with mechanical work was not just surprising, it was incomprehensible. As Klaus watched Princess Elizabeth work, he found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about British society. The propaganda had portrayed the British aristocracy as decadent parasites who lived in luxury while their subjects suffered. Yet here was the heir to the throne, working as hard as any common soldier. The daily interactions between Princess Elizabeth and the POWs were necessarily limited by security protocols and language barriers. Direct conversation was minimal, restricted to basic work-related communication, but actions spoke louder than words, and the prisoners observed everything with keen attention. They watched as the princess arrived each morning at the same time as everyone else, carrying her own tools and wearing the same practical uniform. They saw her struggle with difficult repairs, persist through frustration, and celebrate small victories with genuine satisfaction. They witnessed her treat everyone, regardless of rank or nationality, with the same basic courtesy. One incident that particularly impressed the prisoners occurred when Marco Rossi, an Italian POW, accidentally dropped a wrench while working under a vehicle. Princess Elizabeth, passing nearby, picked up the tool and handed it back with a simple, "Here you go." The gesture was small, but its impact was profound. In that moment, she had treated an enemy prisoner with the same consideration she would show any colleague. For Marco, who had been captured in North Africa and had spent months in various POW camps, this interaction crystallized something he had been struggling to understand about British society. The princess had not seen an enemy when she looked at him. She had seen a person doing a job who needed assistance. The cultural differences between the prisoners and their captors became apparent in countless small ways. Hans Weber, another German POW, had been raised in the rigid hierarchy of Nazi ideology. He had been taught that society functioned best when everyone knew their place and stayed within clearly defined roles. The sight of a princess performing manual labor violated every principle he had been taught about proper social order. Yet as Hans observed Princess Elizabeth day after day, he began to see something that challenged his preconceptions. Her authority did not come from fear or intimidation. It came from competence and example. When she gave instructions or suggestions, people listened not because they had to, but because they respected her knowledge and dedication. The Italian prisoners, many of whom had already begun to question fascist ideology after Italy's surrender in 1943, were more receptive to what they were witnessing. They had seen enough of British society to recognize that it operated on different principles than what they had known at home. The princess's behavior was unusual, but it was consistent with the broader pattern of British egalitarianism they had observed. Conversations among the prisoners often revolved around these observations. During evening hours in their quarters, they debated what they had seen and what it meant. Some remained skeptical, convinced that the princess's service was merely a propaganda exercise. Others began to see it as evidence of a fundamentally different approach to leadership and social responsibility. The work itself created opportunities for cooperation that transcended national boundaries. When a critical repair required multiple people, Princess Elizabeth and the POWs often found themselves working as a team. Language barriers necessitated communication through gestures and demonstrations, but the shared goal of completing the task fostered a sense of common purpose. One particularly memorable incident occurred when an ambulance broke down during a training exercise. The vehicle was needed urgently for a medical emergency drill, and every available mechanic was pressed into service. Princess Elizabeth diagnosed the problem as a faulty fuel pump, while Klaus Müller and 2 other German POWs worked to remove the damaged component. For several hours, they worked side by side in focused concentration. The princess held flashlights while the prisoners accessed hard-to-reach components. They passed tools back and forth, pointed out potential solutions, and coordinated their efforts with the efficiency of an experienced team. When the repair was finally completed and the ambulance roared back to life, there was a moment of shared satisfaction that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. Another significant event occurred during a particularly challenging day when a convoy of vehicles needed urgent maintenance before deployment. Rain had turned the motor pool into a muddy quagmire, making every task more difficult and unpleasant. Princess Elizabeth and the POWs worked together in the miserable conditions, their uniforms soaked and their hands numb with cold. As they struggled to replace a transmission in the pouring rain, Hans Weber found himself genuinely impressed by the princess's determination. She refused to seek shelter or delegate the unpleasant work to others. Instead, she crawled under the vehicle alongside everyone else, emerging covered in mud and oil but determined to complete the job. That evening, as the prisoners cleaned their tools and prepared for the night, Hans reflected on what he had witnessed. This woman, who would one day rule an empire, had chosen to share in the most difficult and unglamorous aspects of military service. It was a form of leadership he had never encountered before, and it forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about authority and responsibility. The impact of these experiences on the prisoners' worldview was profound and lasting. Many began to question the propaganda they had been fed about British society and values. Letters home, though carefully censored, began to contain subtle hints of their changing perspectives. Klaus Müller wrote to his family, "They treat us fairly here. The work is hard but honest, and even their leaders share in the labor. It is not as we were told." The censors allowed such comments to pass, recognizing that they served British interests by demonstrating the humane treatment of prisoners. The prisoners also began to discuss among themselves the implications of what they were witnessing. If the British princess could work alongside former enemies with dignity and respect, what did that say about the nature of the conflict they had been fighting? If their captors could treat them as human beings rather than monsters, perhaps the divisions between nations were not as fundamental as they had been taught. These conversations were not limited to philosophical discussions. The prisoners began to see practical applications of British democratic values in their daily lives. Decisions were made through consultation rather than arbitrary command. Problems were solved through cooperation rather than coercion. Conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than force. For many of the prisoners, this was their first exposure to a society that operated on principles of consensus and mutual respect. The contrast with the authoritarian systems they had known was stark and thought-provoking. Some began to imagine what their own countries might look like if they adopted similar approaches to governance and social organization. As spring turned to summer in 1945, the war in Europe moved rapidly toward its conclusion. The fall of Berlin in May brought an end to the fighting, but the work at Camberley continued. Vehicles still needed maintenance, and the skills being taught there would be valuable in the post-war reconstruction effort. Princess Elizabeth completed her training with distinction, earning her qualification as a fully trained mechanic and driver. Her instructors noted that she had mastered every aspect of the curriculum and had demonstrated exceptional leadership qualities throughout her service. More importantly, she had proven that royal duty could be expressed through practical service rather than ceremonial obligation. For the POWs, the end of the war brought the prospect of repatriation to their home countries. Processing for return to Germany and Italy began immediately, but the bureaucratic machinery moved slowly. Many prisoners remained at Camberley for months after the fighting ended, continuing their work while awaiting transportation home. During this transition period, the interactions between Princess Elizabeth and the POWs took on a different character. The formal hostilities were over, and the artificial barriers between former enemies began to dissolve. Conversations became more frequent and more personal, though still limited by language barriers and protocol requirements. In one of their final encounters, Princess Elizabeth approached Klaus Müller as he was cleaning his tools at the end of a workday. Through a translator, she thanked him for his professional dedication and wished him well in his return to civilian life. Klaus, surprised by the gesture, responded that he had learned much about British values through his service at Camberley. The exchange was brief and formal, but it represented something significant. Two people who had been enemies were parting with mutual respect, having discovered their common humanity through shared work and experience. It was a small moment, but it embodied the possibility of reconciliation and understanding that would be essential for post-war reconstruction. As the POWs prepared to leave Camberley, many reflected on how their time there had changed their understanding of the world. They had arrived as prisoners, expecting harsh treatment, and viewing their captors as enemies. They were leaving with a new appreciation for democratic values, and a recognition that former enemies could become partners in building a better future. The lessons learned at Camberley would have lasting impact on post-war relations between Britain and the former Axis powers. The prisoners who returned home carried with them stories of fair treatment, democratic governance, and principled leadership. These personal testimonies helped to counteract years of propaganda and contributed to the gradual reconciliation between former enemies. For Princess Elizabeth, her service in the ATS was a formative experience that would influence her approach to monarchy for the rest of her life. She had learned that true leadership required understanding the lives and challenges of ordinary people. She had discovered that authority was most effective when it was based on competence and example rather than inherited privilege. The future queen had also learned the value of practical service. By working alongside people from all backgrounds, including former enemies, she had gained insights into human nature that would serve her well in her later role as head of state. She understood that respect must be earned through actions rather than demanded through position. Years later, as Queen Elizabeth II, she would draw upon these lessons in her approach to constitutional monarchy. Her commitment to duty, her understanding of ordinary people's lives, and her belief in the power of personal example, all traced back to those months at Camberley when she worked as a mechanic alongside prisoners of war. The story of Princess Elizabeth and the POWs at Camberley represents something larger than a simple wartime anecdote. It illustrates the power of personal example to bridge divides and challenge preconceptions. It demonstrates that leadership is most effective when it is grounded in service rather than privilege. Most importantly, it shows that even in the midst of the most destructive conflict in human history, it was possible for former enemies to recognize their common humanity. The princess who carried tools and fixed army trucks, watched in disbelief by prisoners of war, had created a small space where understanding could flourish, despite the artificial barriers of war. In that muddy motor pool at Camberley, surrounded by the machinery of war, a future queen learned lessons about leadership that would guide her for 7 decades, and a group of former enemies discovered that their captors possessed virtues they had been taught to despise. It was a quiet revolution, accomplished not through grand gestures or political speeches, but through the simple act of working together toward a common goal. The grease-stained hands of a princess and the respectful attention of prisoners of war created a moment of understanding that transcended the hatred and division of wartime. It was a glimpse of the better world that would emerge from the ashes of conflict, built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared humanity that had been discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. If you found this remarkable story of Princess Elizabeth's wartime service as fascinating as we did, please give this video a thumbs up. Your likes help us bring more incredible historical stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content exploring the untold moments that shaped our world. We're constantly uncovering amazing stories from history that deserve to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What surprised you most about Princess Elizabeth's service in the ATS? Did you know about her mechanical training before watching this video? Share your thoughts and let us know what other historical stories you'd like us to explore. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.